Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And happy 2025, our first time getting to talk in the new year. How has your new year been so far?
More the same, aside from the crazy things happening in the world, my life has proceeded pretty similarly. I'm pretty busy, but that's a good thing. So
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, listeners actually not listeners, but those who are watching on YouTube might notice that I'm in a different location. We moved very early in January, which has been a bit of a headache, but nice to be in a new place and a new office. And yeah.
And if I may, viewers, you'll note that Father Wesley is sitting in front of a large number of boxes that appear to contain alcoholic beverages. This is one of the deep secrets to moving as a reader. If you haven't learned this yet, the best places to get boxes for your books are from the liquor store because they're small, they're the right size for you to put books in without breaking your back, and they have to get rid of them, and so they'll just give them to you for free.
They are sturdy boxes for sure.
Yeah.
So there's, I think, about 37 boxes total in just my library, and then we had other books too that belonged to both my wife and me and the kids and all that. So it was a lot of books. The last time we moved, our movers, at the end of the day, we had hired movers. This time we didn't, but the mover said, dang, I'm buying my kids Kindles.
I was berated by the movers last time we moved. They didn't have enough time to get it all done before the end of their shift, and they said, "Well, if you didn't have so many books, we could have gotten it done." And I'm thinking, I don't want your advice on how to live my life. Like,
that's right.
You're here to move my stuff, not tell me what's good in life. So
that sounds like a you problem.
Yeah, right.
Well, our book today is The Castle of Otranto, and we're going to talk about Gothic literature. So I think to start, it's appropriate to ask you, Junius, what's your favorite My Chemical Romance song?
I'm not familiar with that, Wesley. I don't listen to that type of music. What are you talking about?
You don't listen to that? Oh, well, I'm a millennial, so I do. I have to.
If I'm going to listen to one, what should I listen to?
Ooh.
This
Welcome to the Black Parade, of course, is always a good place to start. Famous Last Words is a great sort of anthem, and I'm Not Okay, or Helena. Helena might be the best Gothic song that they have if we're talking about keeping it within the genre. So yeah, you gotta. I'm disappointed, to be honest.
We can't know everything, but I will check it out.
You probably won't like it. All right. Well, anyways, our book for today is written by Horace Walpole, and as mentioned, it is considered a really influential piece entry into the history of Gothic literature. Horace Walpole is an interesting fellow. I do not have much experience with this text prior to this, nor was I familiar with him. I'm assuming, Junius, since you picked it, that you have read it before.
I had, yes. I read it when I was, I'm trying to remember. I know I read it in college. The question was I assigned to read it, or did I just read it? I think what probably happened was that we were talking about Gothic novels, and we read some excerpts of some Gothic novels. Either that happened, or they assigned this work. Either way, I just thought it was the darndest thing. I was really struck by it, and it stuck with me. I don't know that I've read it since then. I may have read it one other time since then, but I'm not sure. But it's definitely remained. It's captured my imagination because I have a bit of a melancholy imagination, and so I'm susceptible to the Gothic to begin with. And then it's also one of the aspects of the Gothic is the supernatural / fantastical, and that's also my bag. And then, of course, as we'll talk about, there's the writing itself is just so incredibly good. So, so it stuck out of my imagination. I was wanting to read it again, and I thought this would be a good place to do it. And I'm really glad that we did, because I just loved every moment of rereading it.
Yeah, me too. No, this was a fantastic read. And so after I finished, I like to wait to know more about the author till after reading the book usually. So I did a little bit of deep dive into Horace Walpole, who is a fascinating guy. He was born in like 1717 in London, and his father, Robert Walpole, is considered basically the first prime minister of England, which I thought was really interesting. And Horace then lived a pretty privileged life. he had a pretty serious interest in art and literature and history. He was able to travel around Europe pretty extensively. And he lived in a house that he designed called Strawberry Hill. Have you've seen this?
Yeah, yeah.
It's wild. It's a white house, almost palace looking, but it is very Gothic in terms of its architecture. Lots of sharp angles, spires sort of reaching up out of the structure. And so you can almost see when you look at the house his imagination in a different way. Like it maps onto the book really well in some kind of weird ways.
It's how I sort of imagine that Tim Burton and Helena Bonham Carter's house looks.
Yes.
So then Strawberry Hill, right? I mean, what an interesting name for it. You know, it's not, you expect some crazy name like the Eyrie or, you know, the Crags, but no, Strawberry Hill.
Yeah, it sounds rather cheery, but it's not. I guess the whiteness of it, because it's a very white house, that is interesting and maybe a little bit counter. Like if it was a darker color, it would definitely be more ominous, but the whiteness makes it a little less scary, I suppose. We'll include a picture of this in the show notes so that people can kind of see what we're talking about. So it's interesting. So he lived in this house, and he did a lot of writing. He wrote a lot of letters, a lot of essays, and other novels. But this one is probably his most famous, and it's often considered, at least by some, to be the first Gothic novel. And if not the very first, it's certainly one of the most influential early on. So how would you define Gothic literature, Junius, for someone? Because that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it's, I don't know, coming up with a precise definition is maybe a little difficult.
It is. It's very difficult. And so I'm going to characterize rather than define. Just got to protect myself as a philosopher there. To me, Gothic literature is, so first of all, you know, the time we're talking about is we're talking about the mid 18th century through the early 19th century. That was a sort of heyday of Gothic. And the Gothic gave way to Romanticism. We'll have occasion to circle back around to this at the end, but Gothic both paved the way for Romanticism and sort of ceded its place to Romanticism, and Walter Scott was the big figure in that handover. The two main ideas that come to mind when you think about Gothic literature are a sense of melancholy that sort of hangs over the text, and so the general air of the text is very melancholic, and then also supernaturalism. There's a sense in which I'm tempted to compare it to magical realism, but it's really, the distinction is that it's generally particularly the supernatural in the broad sense of that, is including ghosts and spirits and that sort of a thing, as opposed to the fantastical as such. That is the hallmark of the Gothic. And so you're living there are these characters who are living in these worlds where they are exposed to supernatural influence. And there are either the melancholy disposition of the characters themselves, generally speaking, and sometimes often also of the setting, whether it's a dark forest or the blasted Scottish moor or wherever else.
A dark castle.
A dark castle, for instance, right? And there's this sense of, gosh, there's something psychological about it. Is this primarily a psychological thing? But the supernatural elements are, you can't reduce them to psychological excitations, right? This is something that's really happening, and it's happening to also be happening on a susceptible mind. So later post-Gothic revival ideas, novels, would be things like Wuthering Heights, right? The Bronte sisters are deeply influenced by Gothic novels.
Yeah, and so is like Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. Bram Stoker. I mean, all these are sort of continuations of the same movement.
That's right. And it's funny, when I was growing up, we had kids at high school who were called goths. And they're dressed in black and they painted their nails black and all this sort of a thing. I hope that's done, but it may not be. But this notion of the Gothic, once it creeps into the Western imagination, it has never really gone away.
That's right. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is there does tend to be a preoccupation with themes like death and decay. I mean, we mentioned it's melancholy, but death and decay tend to be very forefront in terms of focus, or they're always kind of there, even if in the background. There's usually a sense of foreboding.
Yeah, so you might get things like we have in this novel. Prophecy is a common theme because it sets the nerves on edge, right? Anything that creates that kind of tension. They also tend to have, and I don't know. I actually don't know why they originally started calling them Gothic, but I wonder if part of it isn't connected, and perhaps you do know the answer to this. I wonder if part of it's connected to the fact that the plots do tend to have a lot of twists and turns. And so in the same way, the Gothic style is, it's sweeping and high and foreboding, but it's also very intricate and adorned. And I think that's also describes these novels very well.
That's right. It's very complex because I mean, even this book, which is not very long, every character, there are so many little intricacies that one has to consider when you think about the plot from their perspective. The layers of sort of the political, the emotional, the power structures, and all of that kind of come to bear in each of the characters in different ways, and it produces different results, but they're all stressful.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. One of the comparisons I made to my wife about this book, as I was talking to her about it, was it's like a soap opera. It's the reason we have soap operas, but it's not soap opera-y because it was not a tired, worn-out trope when it happened. This was happening for the first time. But this sense of, these every chapter, there's a major and sometimes several major twists and turns and big reveals, and all the characters, they all get roped in, and so is related to so and there's this tragic backstory where this happened. You don't know who you are, but actually you thought he was dead, but I revealed to you now so and so, right? I think the soap opera is the best place in contemporary culture to see those dynamics at play at the same level that you see them in these books, where it's just chock full of that stuff, right? But judging, it wouldn't be right to judge this book on that basis. Rather, this is what a modern soap opera is the degeneration of the Gothic form into a fetishistic form, into pure trivialism. It's just shock for shock's sake. Whereas in this earlier Gothic thing, yes, some of it is for shock's sake, but it's serving a higher artistic purpose. It's pointing beyond the shock to, it's all about what the novel does, how it plays on your nerves, and draws you into a realization of your own vulnerability before a grand world, right? Which is not something you get from soap operas, which they just want you to mimic the feelings of the characters on the screen in order to keep you addicted to their lives.
Have you seen the Saturday Night Live skits, the Californians?
No.
Oh, it's perfect. It's a sort of satire on soap operas, and so it's a bunch of Californian people, and it's like, it's so trivial that that's kind of what the joke is. Like a lot of the conflict revolves around driving directions in California. Like, oh, I took the 405 to the 322, and they're like, dun, dun, dun. Yeah, exactly. No, they literally have that sound effect. So I'll have to link those too, because those are brilliant skits that do sort of poke fun at how it's so trivialized.
Yeah. Well, I grew up with my mom was really addicted to soap operas. And so she planned her day. She stayed at home, and she planned her day around being able to watch them. And so she'd have to get all of her, morning work done by the time they started. And then she was able to sit still for 3-4 hours at a time and watch through all of her favorite ones. And then she would get up and start getting ready for dinner and things like that. And she did that for decades, right? And at one point in my youth, I got into them with her, and I was watching, and then I stopped watching, and then I came back. I saw her watching them some 20 years later, right? And I was like, wait, that's that character that was a child on the show when I was watching, and now they've grown up and are doing the same things their parents were doing, and the cyclical nature of it was so apparent, right? And it's just, you're just spinning the same stories over and over again and following these characters through their entire lives. And there's no higher end. It's just get addicted to all these characters' bad choices. That's not what reading a Gothic novel is like. There's one of the roles of the prophecy and the sense of, and the supernatural itself, is to keep the story focused on its end. I'm thinking of a million potential end notes as we talk about this, and part of the reason for that is because of how deeply influential this stuff has been. But one antecedent of this Gothic tradition that we should bring on the table is Hamlet, right? Hamlet is the most Gothic of Shakespeare's plays. and that the ghost in Hamlet continually appears to drive Hamlet on towards the end of the play. Same thing happens in Macbeth, where just as things are starting to get overly political and all this other kind of stuff, either the Weird Sisters or Hecate or something shows up to move Macbeth towards his fated end, his doomed end. And so these are highly teleological. Yeah. And that's what keeps them from falling into the self-obsessive inanity of a soap opera, is soap operas are allergic to ends, because you don't want it to end, because then you lose your audience. You've got to keep stringing people along. From the very beginning, this text is pointed at its resolution.
Yes.
And what's interesting then is, okay, so how do we arrive at that resolution through all these twists and turns? Yep. And to what extent are the characters' actions impacting the resolution at all? Or to what extent is it doesn't really matter what anyone does, we're always going to end up here?
Yes. That actually kind of bleeds into a discussion that I want to have in a few minutes about similarities and differences between this and Oedipus Rex, which we've done in the past. But before we get there, perhaps we could just briefly recap the plot for our listeners.
Yeah. Gosh, this is going to sound crazy. If you haven't read this yet, spoilers ahead.
Yeah.
But it's going to sound crazy, but trust us that it hangs together wonderfully.
And before we even talk about the plot, I should say, what's interesting about this novel is that initially when it was published, Walpole claimed that it was actually a translation from an ancient Italian manuscript that had been written in like 1529 and was discovered in the library of an ancient Catholic family. And you can kind of, I could buy it, if I was alive during his day, I could buy it.
Yeah, that's right. And there's two prefaces. There's the original preface in which he talks about that. And then there's the preface from later on, a few years later, when it has been very successful. And he's sort of explaining himself. This is why I went through the literary fiction of saying that it was a real text, because I wasn't sure how this would be received. And that's because people weren't writing like this, right? Mm-hmm. He's creating a new way of writing, and he's a peer of the realm. And so he's terrified that this is not going to go over well. But once it does go over well, then he steps out from the shadows and says, actually, I made this up, you guys. It was all me.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. And from what I can tell, by the way, Walpole was not particularly religious.
I have no sense that he is. Yeah.
It is I think there is a lot of Catholic imagery and it feels authentic. I mean, I kind of wondered when I was reading it, because I waited till after I finished it to look him up. But, I kind of wondered, was he an English Catholic, which at the time would have been somewhat rare. And but then I looked it up, and it didn't seem like he was really interested in any sort of organized religion.
Yeah, when you look at it, I mean, what dominates here is vengeance and not grace. And also at the end, when the soul of whoever it was who was killed, who owned the castle, when it's received up into heaven, it's received by the local patron saint, right? Yep. So it feels very trappings of religion to me, rather than someone who has a good feel for what's going on. But if that's incorrect, I apologize to the departed spirit of Mr. Walpole. So this thing is it's set in this castle of Otranto, in case you didn't know. And this whole castle has a backstory that we learn over the course of the thing. And the backstory is that it had belonged to, what is the name of the past prince of Otranto?
Oh, I can't remember.
It's Alfonso.
Yeah.
Alfonso had died without issue, and the castle had come to one of his servants, who is the grandfather, I believe, of the current Prince of Otranto. So Alfonso's been dead for a couple of generations, and this castle has remained in the family of his servant that entire time. That's kind of the situation coming into it, and we don't think there's anything funny about that. People die without issue all the time. Someone's got to take up the fief. That's just kind of what happens. But as the story goes along, every aspect of that claim gets complicated, to where it turns out that, while it's true that Alfonso died, it's true that these men took up the castle, not under the circumstances that you thought. And None of the rest of that really goes the way that you thought it did. And there's this prophecy that the family of Manfred's our current Prince of Otranto, would be dispossessed when the the rightful owner of the castle, grew too large for it. When the rightful owner of the castle grew too large for it, and the rightful owner is not a reference to Manfred, it's a reference to Alfonso.
Right.
And so the plot gets going when, on the day of the morning of Manfred's son's wedding. So Manfred's son is going to get married, and then they're hopefully going to have children, and that will continue his line. And it's a great day for Manfred. And his sickly, weakling son, as he's crossing the courtyard to the chapel to get married, is killed by a massive helmet that apparently just falls from heaven. They don't say how it got there, but we come out to find him crushed to death under a massive helmet. And no one can account for where this helmet came from or why it's there.
Yep.
So that's the thing. This is our introduction into the story. I mean, this happens on like the second page of the story. Right. And so right out of the gate, you're in for something crazy. And that's when I was hooked on the story, right? I'm reading this thing like, okay, this is fine, whatever. And then I see this kid's crushed under this giant helmet, and I'm like, oh, this is wonderful. Oh my gosh, I love this.
Yeah, no, it thrusts you right into the action. And of course, when the helmet falls, we don't know anything about the questionable claims to the rightful ownership of the castle.
That's right.
But the death of the son causes the father to, well, I don't know so much if he's going mad or if it's bringing out certain aspects of who he is, because he decides that he's going to divorce his saintly wife, Hippolyta, and marry his son's fiance, Isabella, who he is supposed to be basically the guardian of.
That's right.
So it's a betrayal on multiple levels, and it's not good. And so Isabella, who was not particularly fond of the son, runs away and goes into the church next to the castle as a way of claiming sanctuary.
Yeah.
And she, in order to do that, she has the help of a peasant named Theodore. And Theodore is really important because when the helmet falls on the son, Theodore is there. And he kind of has a run-in with Manfred, the father, and he gets basically imprisoned in the helmet.
Yeah, he's the one who makes the connection that the helmet looks just like the helmet on the statue of Alfonso in the chapel.
That's right.
That makes Manfred angry, and he's like, he accuses Theodore of being a necromancer who conjured this helmet out of the sky to kill his son, and so he imprisons him under the helmet without food or water until he can decide what to do with him.
And you sort of think maybe he's warranted in it because when Isabel is escaping, Theodore's just sort of there.
Yeah, he just shows up. And what happened was that the helmet, when they put him under it, it cracked the floor, and that part of the floor collapsed, and he's able to escape down to the lower level. And when he gets there, he happens to be escaping just at exactly the moment that Isabella's coming out, and she's come to that room because she knows of a trap door in that room she can use to escape to the chapel. So it's all these coincidences that keep coming together, and you think, wow, that's ridiculous, but you've got to remember it's the outworking of a prophecy.
That's right.
And so they're not coincidences. There's some power that is driving all of these acts on towards their conclusion.
That's right.
I want to talk more about Isabella's and Manfred's, the impropriety of his desire for her, but we'll circle back around to that after we finish laying out the plot some more.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So basically, as the rest of the story unfolds, there are a lot of weird supernatural things that happen in the castle. There are ghostly apparitions and disembodied voices and worldly visions. The servants keep seeing a giant, like just parts of the giant, like they'll open a door and there's the leg of the giant or something like that.
And if you pay close attention, they tend to come at times when Manfred is especially worked up and is right on the edge of doing something particularly dangerous. And so these can be seen both as warnings, a sort of turn back, oh man, but also as judgments, right? As he's impending, his actions are drawing forth the apparitions that are ultimately going to be his undoing.
Yes. And we should say there's a bishop, or not a bishop, a friar, who is sort of the rector of the church there, who opposes Manfred much to his consternation. So the friar won't allow the divorce.
Yep.
And he recognizes that that the thing that Manfred wants to do is really wicked. So he's resisting that because he's a good priest. At least we think he's a good priest. But it turns out through the course of events that we find out that not only is Theodore the priest's son, but also that the priest and Theodore have a claim to the castle.
That's right.
But all this is happening too while there's a bit of a love triangle.
Yeah.
Isabella feels indebted to Theodore because he saved her life, basically. But Theodore is in love with Matilda, the daughter of
Manfred.
And
Matilda has spent her whole life gazing lovingly on a portrait of Alfonso that hangs in the castle. She thinks he's just so handsome and the paragon of knighthood and all this other sort of stuff. And Theodore looks just like Alfonso.
Yep.
So the moment she sees him, she's predisposed to fall in love with him. So Theodore and Matilda have a connection going on, but Isabella loves Theodore, and everybody else thinks that Theodore and Isabella has, especially Manfred, thinks Theodore and Isabella have been having an affair under his nose all this time, which isn't true. They just met.
Yes. And so one of the sort of big climaxes of the story occurs when it's Matilda and Theodore meeting together secretly.
By accident, mind you.
By accident, right. And Manfred thinks that it's Isabella and Theodore, and he rushes in and he stabs with a knife and he accidentally kills his daughter.
Yeah. He thinks he's stabbing Isabella, but he winds up stabbing Matilda.
Yes, which of course makes Theodore quite riled up.
Yeah. But before that, there is a knight known as the Knight of the Giant Sword, who shows up with an enormous retinue. He's got several hundred followers that come with him to argue that Manfred's claim is illegitimate and he needs to restore the castle to someone with a better claim who was a closer servant of Alfonso. While they're debating all this and talking all this out, it comes out that that knight is actually the lord he's pretending to be serving on the one hand, and that lord is looking for Isabella because Isabella has been, she's been living in the castle for a while and kind of against this guy's wishes. And so he's coming to take Isabella back, and he winds up for catching Theodore and Isabella, who have wound up accidentally in the same place again. And Theodore thinks that he's working for Manfred and wants to take Isabella back to Manfred. So he fights the knight and wounds him, they think mortally. And as he lies there dying, as he believes, but he isn't, he reveals to Isabella that he's actually Isabella's father.
Yes.
So then that all comes out, and then Manfred, who is still trying to get Isabella, he notices, what is Isabella's father's name? You happen to remember that?
I can't remember the character's name.
Put my hand on that quickly. He realizes that this knight has fallen in love with his own daughter, Matilda, and so he proposes that they do a swap where he will marry Isabella and he will let Isabella's father marry his daughter, Matilda. And Isabella's father is very, very interested in this because he's fallen in love with Matilda in this short time. And so they're trying to move that forward at the same time. And all of this, so this is all ruined when Manfred kills Matilda. It takes away the one piece he had to try to press his claim with Isabella's father. And it also finally, at the end of the story, breaks his spirit.
Yes. And so at the end, Theodore is able to take the throne, basically, and he marries Isabella, which seems like
confession, really.
yeah, poor Isabella.
Yeah, so Isabella's father's name was Frederick.
That's right.
And yeah, so Matilda dies, and Theodore is heartbroken because he had given his entire heart to Matilda, even though his father had warned him against it, because his father's like, you don't know who you are. You can't love a daughter of Manfred. But he does. And so at the end, it's said that Manfred and Hippolyta give up Otranto and go to the monastery and convents, live out the rest of their days in holy prayer and contemplation. Theodore then resumes, because Theodore, by the way, is actually Alfonso's grandson. Alfonso didn't actually die without issue, as everyone had thought. And so there's that piece as well. He's got a double secret identity, both as the son of this friar who's the count of somewhere, and also as the grandson of Alfonso. But everyone says you should just marry Isabella because she's here and she's pretty and that could kind of solve everything. And he was like, no, I don't want to hear anything about marriage. I can't. I'm so heartbroken. But Isabella and Matilda were best friends, because when we talk about Isabella being under Manfred's fostership, she's been in the castle for years. She's basically grown up in the castle because the wedding has been contracted for a long time, and she's growing up there until she'll be old enough to marry Conrad. And so Theodore and Isabella are able to share in their memories of Matilda and commiserate in their pain over the loss of their beloved. And eventually Theodore decides, well, I couldn't do much better than to be married to the person who can commiserate with me over the greatest tragedy of my life. So he marries Isabella because it's kind of like the marriage at the end of The Horse and His Boy, where Shasta and Aramis get married, so it's easier to make it more convenient for fighting. Theodore and Isabella get married so they can more easily reminisce about Matilda.
Yes. Yeah, it's kind of an unsatisfying ending in that regard. That I mean, I just feel bad for Isabella more than anything else.
Because she's so sweet. She does nothing wrong. She tries so hard, and she even...
And she actually loves him.
She does. And she gives up her share in him when she realizes that Matilda loves him and he loves Matilda. And she's like, I want my friend to be happy.
Yes.
Yeah, she deserves better than, oh, well, I guess you're better than anything else.
Yep.
So yeah, this plot is all over the place, you guys. I mean, it's crazy. It is nuts. And
it keeps you on your toes.
It does. One of the quirks of the way it's written is that the dialogue doesn't start a new line every time a new person speaks, but there'll be these long paragraphs where the dialogue is going back and forth between 2 or 3 or 4 characters, and you just have these EM dashes to show you that where we would have a paragraph break. One of the effects of that is that it does make it feel very fast-paced and keeps you moving forward and running along with the story. And you can get this sense of, this paragraph, when it began 2.5 pages ago, the world of the story was very different when that paragraph began than where it has wound up by the time we reach the end of that paragraph.
Yeah. So why don't we circle back to the impropriety aspect before we do anything else?
Yeah, so you mentioned that she was Manfred's ward, and she's been living in the castle for all these years, and so he has already been doing the duty of a father to her for all these years. As part of the marriage contract, she's placed under his care as a parent, and so he's like a foster parent to her. So there's that relationship, but also this is a bit like, you remember, cast your mind back to biblical times when Joseph found out that Mary was pregnant, even though they were only engaged and not married, he would need to divorce her because the engagement was a bigger deal than it is for us. You don't break off engagements lightly. So the fact that she was engaged to Conrad and that it was in fact their wedding day, he's already her father-in-law. Like, there's already at least societal and maybe as strong as even ecclesiastical ban against them coming together, because it's as if they're already related in a forbidden degree. And so all of her taboos are being activated. My father and my father-in-law happen to be the same person, are suddenly wanting to marry me. This is deeply immoral and gross, and I can't have anything to do with that.
Yes. And not to mention that he's asking for a divorce to do it.
From a woman who she views as her mother, who is a literal saint.
Yes.
And who's done nothing wrong other than her failure to produce more than one male heir.
Yep.
It's not even like she failed to produce a male heir. She kicked one out. Of course, he's super sickly, but he didn't die because he was sickly.
That's right.
Right? He died from natural causes. You drop a helmet on somebody and naturally they're going to die.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that, in fact, that ecclesiastical sort of there's a kind of ecclesial law drama. It's like a procedural almost at times, where it's like, the priest will not, he's insistent he will not grant the annulment because it's not just. And he tells her that she has to resist it, basically, because it's so wrong for him to do that.
But Manfred argues that they're too closely related. He and Hippolyta, and his conscience has been pricking him for years over how closely they're related. It's actually within the closeness that is forbidden by the church for marriage, and he feels that he has a duty to his conscience and to God to at last act upon this, and that throws the fire for a loop at a second. And the fire is like, well. But he makes the right call, which is this is really something Rome needs to rule on. This is not something for the local friar to be ruling on, right?
Yes. We in the early books of common prayer, there were tables that would be that the priest could use to determine whether or not a couple could get married based on the consanguinity laws. If the spouse is X number of cousins, then it's not allowed, but if it's Y number of cousins, it is allowed.
Right.
Clearly, I mean, in the ancient or in the medieval time and even later, I mean, the populations simply weren't as large. And so, you're living in the same area that your family's lived in for a long time. And there is a good chance that you are, marrying someone who might be a relative in some way.
Yeah. And then that's exacerbated with the nobility when they're only marrying other nobility and they're all getting increasingly related every generation. Well, isn't it the case that, wasn't that Henry's argument for getting out of his first marriage, Henry VIII?
Sort of. His argument was that Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, had been married to his since deceased brother.
That's what it was. Yeah.
And so they
hadn't consummated that marriage.
He appealed to Leviticus because Leviticus says you shouldn't marry your brother's wife. And then it also prescribes childlessness as the punishment for that. And so Henry and Catherine of Aragon received a dispensation to get married from the Pope, but they kept losing children, except for Mary, who became queen briefly. They had no living children. It was miscarriage after miscarriage, stillbirth, infants dying. And so I think there's a sense in which I think, and of course, I'm not a great Henry VIII apologist. He wasn't a great guy, but there's a sense in which I think that takes a toll on someone. And you probably start to wonder, maybe I am cursed. Maybe this is, maybe we are breaking the divine law. And so he appeals for the annulment, which of course had been granted to many other nobles in Europe during the medieval period, but Catherine's
because it's harder to do that when you received a papal dispensation already and you're asking for an annulment on the basis of that for which you received a dispensation.
Yes, and it was complicated by the fact that Catherine's nephew had recently done some maneuvering and had basically taken the Pope hostage. So there was just no receiving that dispensation, which is why, of course, the Anglican Church became a separate entity from the Roman Catholic Church. But that's not what our story's about necessarily. So, interesting. I mean, it certainly could be the case.
I think in the eyes of the original audience, right? Like, they're going to see a connection. Like, oh, this is sort of like the Henry VIII thing.
Yeah.
And then, whether they thought that Henry VIII was arguing correctly or in good faith or not, you have that overlay in the background, and you can see that Manfred's not arguing in good faith, right? I mean, it's very clear to us that. First, he thinks, I'm going to get me some heirs on this younger girl. And then he comes up with the excuse after the fact to try to bring it to fruition.
It's a very ad hoc, very convenient excuse that Manfred offers that they're closely related. And it's interesting because Hippolyta sort of does struggle with it. I mean, there seems to be a part of her where she's like, yeah, I kind of would prefer just to go to the convent and take up a monastic vow.
Yeah. And this is fascinating because you might think my first jocking response is, well, of course she's married to Manfred. Like, who wouldn't prefer living in a convent? But it says over and over again in the text, she loves him deeply and she's devoted to him, and she does everything he says joyfully because it's her joy to serve the man she loves, who is also her lord, both her married lord and her feudal lord, right? And so she's a wonderful image of someone whose heart is unified. Yeah. It's so easy for her to think about remaining in her marriage or going to the convent because she has her loves properly ordered, and she is deeply committed to each of her loves, and so it's very natural. And Matilda has that from her. Matilda is a devoted daughter to both of her parents, but especially to her mother. And Matilda's greatest desire has always been to go to the convent, and they won't let her. And so the fact that she falls in love at the end of the story and in a sense dies for love is not the end she would have foreseen for herself.
That's right. That's right. And it's interesting that her saintliness, Matilda's saintliness, sort of turns Manfred off. He doesn't like her very much.
Yeah.
I think he sees her as an inconvenience. Of course, he's not going to receive a male heir from her. There's, she's not a male. And so, she's clearly an afterthought, but one looks at the way Manfred acts, and it seems as though holiness is a repellent to him.
Which makes sense because he's so, he's not wicked in the sense that he's opposed to everything holy. He's just deeply and thoroughly worldly. His whole concern is with the continuance of the line and shoring that up. There's another aspect. It's not part of the central prophecy, but there's another prophecy, I guess, or something that's connected to it that says that Manfred's family would hold Otranto as long as their line didn't fail. And that's kind of like duh. That's what it means to hold a place, right? I mean, like everybody loses their territory when their family fails. But he's got this sense that he has to ensure that the line continues because he's got almost a supernatural promise that his family will be able to hold on to it. So when Conrad dies, he sees himself vulnerable, and he immediately hits himself and his whole family, and he immediately begins setting about machinations to try to shore that up and lock that in. But the reality is, Conrad has died. He is without male issue. His only hope is Matilda. And so it's so fitting that he is the one to kill Matilda and put the nail in the coffin for any possibility of his line continuing.
Yes. One other thing I think to highlight about Manfred real quick is very much related to this, but there are certain circles in which today you hear a kind of romanticization of the past. And one of those kind of romantic inclinations is to go back to a world in which sort of church and state operated together very closely, kind of arm in arm. And they will appeal to the Middle Ages as an example of this. The ruler submits to the church, gives spiritual advice to the ruler. But in this story, you see a number of kind of hairy places where the intersection of those two things can be at odds with each other. So when the friar won't give the annulment for theological reasons and encourages Manfred to repent of his disordered desires and machinations, Manfred repeatedly tells him that as a priest, he shouldn't be interfering in matters of state. In other words, he wants sort of the ecclesial blessing, but he doesn't want the church to actually be able to tell him what to do.
Yeah.
He wants the church to work for the state, not the other way around. And that's always sort of a tension, isn't it? When the two are in bed together.
Especially in England.
Well, I was going to say, this is the story of the English Reformation, where, Henry becomes the supreme head of the church and defender of the faith. And so the church is no longer a sort of independent entity that can speak truthfully to the state. Rather, it's an arm of the state. And so
and Henry's assuming that position is just the realization of something that the English kings had been trying to do since the Norman invasion, because William Rufus, refused to confirm Anselm as the Archbishop of Canterbury and left the Archbishopric of Canterbury vacant so that he could seize the incomes of Canterbury. And then when he finally did allow Anselm to take up the position, he wanted Anselm to be fully subservient to him, and he wouldn't do it. And Anselm was exiled a couple of times. Then, of course, this is what led to the death of Thomas Becket, who was another Archbishop of Canterbury who was in conflict with, I believe it was Henry II. Same thing, right? You have to submit to the crown, and they're like, no. And there were times when the Pope had to. In fact, what was it? It was in what year was it? There were 3 years when England was under papal interdict, and all religious services in England were suspended because the king refused to accept the nomination of the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so the Pope said that the churches can't hold services in England for 3 years. Now, this was also in the Middle Ages. So there's been a long history of this in England, particularly, right?
Yes. Yes. So I think it's an interesting demonstration of how that can go wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that we live in an ideal world either. It's just to say that, where you have a state church and where church and state are really closely intertwined, you will always have a kind of power struggle where the ruler wants certain things and he expects the church to bend over backwards in order to deliver that to him, which of course a good churchman won't do.
Right.
But it definitely isn't the sort of utopia that some people make it out to be.
That's right.
Yeah. And of course, in the Anglican tradition, we have the Oxford movement, which reacted against this idea. That was one of the whole points, was that we're not beholden to the state. We're a church first before we're anything else. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about this book, because as I was reading it, one of our previous books really came to mind, and that's Oedipus Rex. And I think there's a lot of really interesting overlap between the two, similarities, but also differences. And so I kind of wanted to pose the question, is the Castle of Otranto a Christianized version of Oedipus Rex? To which I think maybe. There are certainly similarities. There's prophecy and fate. We already asked the question earlier, does it really matter what the characters do in this story? There's a prophecy. It seems to inevitably come to pass no matter what Manfred tries to do or his various machinations. The prophecy is there. Fate does seem to operate. I mean, just even through coincidence, the fact that Isabella is escaping the same time that Theodore is coming in the room. I mean, they couldn't have planned it better. Or sometimes they couldn't have planned it worse, like when Matilda and Theodore run into each other later in the story. There's also the idea of dynasty and family ties. The way that Oedipus is worried about, losing his position. He wants to hold on to things. Manfred is very similar. And they both have, in that sense, kind of tragic flaws, though I don't know if I would characterize Manfred as quite the same way as Oedipus. I mean, Oedipus's tragic flaw isn't... Oedipus is a likable guy for the most part, except for this one little thing. Manfred strikes me as maybe not being the most likable person. But they both are obsessive about controlling their destinies. That's what really is kind of the what binds them together. And in doing that, they unwittingly fulfill their fates by holding on as tight as they do. And of course, with Manfred, he actually consciously commits immoral acts, whereas or wants to, whereas Oedipus doesn't explicitly do anything immoral to prevent it. So I guess that's a difference between the two. But where I think where it becomes interesting is when we look at some of the differences between the two stories. That's always where I think whenever there's an sort of inner allusion to another work, it's always the difference where is the most interesting. So the divine justice, right? Oedipus is living in a pagan world. Fate and the gods just arbitrarily decide what will happen. There's no real sense of it's not like Oedipus gets what he deserves at the end, because he didn't really do anything wrong.
Right.
Of course, incest is bad and wrong, but he didn't do it knowingly. In fact, he was trying not to do it.
That's right. And as soon as he knew he was doing it, he stopped doing it.
That's right. In this book, it feels very much like judgment is tied more to moral failing in Manfred. And it feels like there's room for repentance and redemption. I mean, you look at the relationship between Theodore and his father. There's a kind of reconciliation that occurs. And at any point, Manfred could come clean. He knows the story about the castle. He could, rather than obsessively hold on to his fate, let go and repent and take up the monastic vows, which he ends up doing anyways. But he could have done that willingly. So there is a sense in which at the end of this book, you can say, yeah, justice was done here in a way that you can't with Oedipus.
That's right. And if you have any doubts about that, his slaying of Matilda seals it, right? He deserves to lose his title. He just killed his daughter. Right? He wasn't trying to kill his daughter, but he was trying to kill a girl who he thought he was killing Isabella, who is as good as his daughter.
Right.
So yeah, you actually were trying to kill a daughter. You just killed the wrong one.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, he killed the one that makes his life a little harder now because he doesn't have the leverage with Frederick.
That's right.
And so there is, I think, a sense of the door is open to Manfred. It's almost like reading. I'm leading a Bible study at church on Exodus. You know, it's like reading Pharaoh. It's like at any point Pharaoh could just say, "Yeah, okay, just go," and he doesn't. He hardens his heart, and Manfred seems to be hardening his heart. Whereas, Oedipus, it's not a hard-hearted. In fact, Oedipus is like, "I want to know what's going on here." You know, he really wants to get to the bottom of it.
You can't handle the truth.
That's right. That's right. His tragedy is simply just rooted in an unchangeable cosmic order. There is no morality to it, really.
Yeah, that's right.
But the moral redemption is open to Manfred, and he just doesn't take it.
That's exactly right. And then that's what, and I think all these different supernatural appearances, they're warnings, and they open the door to opportunity. And multiple times, it tells us that he is not unmoved. Like, he's deeply shaken every time one of these things happens, but he covers it up. Yes. Because, he's got people there and he doesn't want them to see that he's weak or whatever, but he's got the opportunity to say, you know what, it's time. I can see the writing is on the wall. This is going to happen one way or another. The only question is, are you going to go easy or hard? And Manfred goes the hardest way possible.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. In other words, God will get your attention one way or the other. Sometimes it's with a whisper, and sometimes he just hits you over the head with a 2x4.
Or a giant helmet.
Or a giant helmet. But that's what he had to do in order to get Manfred's attention, because he wasn't listening to the subtler intimations, which raises, I think, the larger question of free will.
Yeah.
My take on it, because you asked earlier, does it matter what they do? Is, in a sense, I guess what Oedipus and Walpole share is that there is a kind of ordering of history, which of course Christianity would share with some of the pagan religions, but that there is a kind of ethical response to that ordering from the human actor.
Yes.
That comes forth in this book that doesn't come forth in Oedipus, because it doesn't matter what Oedipus does. The prophecy is going to come true either way.
Yeah.
Whereas in this book, the prophecy might come true. It may be true that Manfred loses his title and that the family loses the castle, but he still has a moral choice in the matter. He could determine how he loses the castle. He could do it with repentance. He could do it with justice, but he chooses not to. And it ends up creating horrors that are worse than he could really probably imagine.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I agree. So, and to summarize, then, no one has the power to change the outcome of what will happen in the large sense of Manfred will lose the castle and it will revert to Theodore. That's going to happen no matter what people do. But how much other death and pain and suffering along the way has to happen, that is in Manfred's power. Right? Yes. At any point, like you said, he could just say, you know what? Gosh, I know that we don't deserve to have this castle, and I can see the writing of all this prophecies coming true. It's time. Yeah. I'm going to step aside. My wife and I are going to go into the monastery. Right? Actually, they wouldn't even have to do that. They could just dispossess themselves of the castle and not go to the monastery and live together as husband and wife. If he does that back in chapter 1 or even in chapter 2. Yep. But at the end of the book, no. I mean, you go to the monastery or face judgment for murder, right? Then that's kind of what you see is as they continue to resist, I'm not going to call it fate, I'm going to call it providence, right? As they continue to resist the will of heaven, the range of action that Manfred has gets smaller and smaller until at the end he's left with no choice.
Yes.
And there's that whole thing of, one of them, maybe the friar or somebody says, I can produce papers that will swear to this effect. And Manfred's like, there's no point. Like, we just saw a giant tear down the walls of the castle. That's all the proof I need. Yep. There's no wiggle room left here. I'm not going to quibble over, show me the proof legally. I got it.
That's right. That's right. It's about reading the signs of the times, right? It's like when Moses' staff turns into a snake, Pharaoh should say, okay, I get it. I get it. But that's human rebellion, right? That's pride. That's on display here. And in that Exodus story, I think that we are all prone to in different ways. We like to harden our hearts and stiffen our necks and kick against the pricks. and never works out, but we like to keep doing it anyways.
We always think, oh, I'm going to be different. I'll get away with it. No, you won't.
Nope.
Nobody gets away with it.
Nope. So for that reason, I actually do appreciate the sort of theological outlook of the book.
Yeah. Whether it's genuine on the author's part or not, he connects it up to truth in a way that it is a Christian worldview that is at work here. And that does have, I think there was a great comparison to Oedipus, because it's not for me as a non-Greek coming to Greek literature, the first word that pops to mind when I think about fate is unfair.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with anything you do. It's just the way you were decreed to suffer. And that's just how it is. But here it's like, yeah, you have agency. You not the agency you wish you had. You can't be whatever you want to be, but you have agency, which is it's a very good reflection of the agency we really have, which is, are we going to work with what we've been given or against it?
Yes. And I think there's probably more room. I hadn't thought about this as much, but probably some room to put this in conversation with Boethius as well, right? Like Manfred could accept what's happening to him, but he fights it, and so it's a very sort of, I mean, Hippolyta, the part that makes her so saintly is her seeming willingness to accept what will happen, with a sort of openness. Which is the same openness. I mean, I think from a Christian perspective, like that's why Mary is such an important person in the church's life, is because she shows us what that looks like. Let it be done to me according to thy will. Recognizing there's not really a better place to be than God's what he wills. Whereas Manfred, it's a very sort of almost existentialist approach of, well, I'm going to impose my will, come what may. This is what I want. I'm going to hold on to that. And that's
he's
not
very Nietzschean.
That's not the way. Yes, he is very Nietzschean. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, as opposed to, I don't know if we've had the occasion to mention this on air or not, but one of my favorite moments in the Commedia and Dante is Piccarda and Paradiso. When it's Dante asked the question we're all wondering, which is, okay, you're in the lowest level of heaven. You're in the barely got in part of heaven, and you're in heaven. I get that. Like, that's great. But isn't it objectively true that it would be better to be higher than you are? Right? And she laughs, as everyone in heaven does. They just laugh at everything. And she says, in his will is our peace.
Yeah.
Right? It would not be better for me to be higher if God wills me to be here. And no one can come here until they have learned that the only place to find peace is in the will of God, not in some abstract objective could have been.
That's right. That is right. Yes, it's better to be a footman in the tents of the Lord than to reign over. And that's very much, I guess, what Manfred learns eventually, maybe, hopefully.
Yeah, here's hoping. I mean, he's got some years in the monastery to figure things out. Which, by the way, years in the monastery, I get the impression that the friar is actually the abbot of that monastery, so he's going to be under the authority of this friar that he's been janking around all story.
It's it's like in that way it's almost like a comedy. It's like at the end all the characters get what they deserve, and it's like it's the worst possible outcome for Manfred because he's got to submit to this guy that he was bossing around.
Yeah.
So excellent. Well, thank you for picking this book. This was a fantastic read. I really enjoyed it.
I'm so glad. It was so great for me to read it again. Just what a wonderful thing.
Well, maybe we could move to our endnotes part of the discussion. What endnote do you have?
So I'm going to go with Sir Walter Scott's Bride of Lammermoor, which is one of his Waverley novels. If you don't know much about Scott besides the Lady of the Lake that we read a few months ago, Scott wrote a large number of novels that collectively are known as the Waverley novels. A lot of those he wrote to get out of debt when a publishing press that he started had failed. He refused to declare bankruptcy, but instead worked hard to pay off all the debts so that others wouldn't suffer for their failures. The Bride of Lammermoor is one of the first, if not, it's not the first. It's one of the earliest of the Waverley novels, and it's Scott was very, very influential on the Romantic period. In fact, many people date the beginning of the Romantic period from the publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798, and they date the end of the Romantic period from the death of Walter Scott in 1832. And so he's clearly deeply related to that period if they're going to date the end of it by his death. But on the other side of it, Scott was deeply influenced by Gothic novels. And so his two major influences were sort of his historical stuff, the Scottish history especially, and then Gothic novels. And so The Bride of Lammermoor brings those both together. It's a historical novel about Lucy, who is the Bride of Lammermoor, and all of these machinations that go on around her and her wedding, and all these things go wrong, and a bunch of people die at the end. And it's got the melancholy air. It's got all the kinds of hallmarks of a Gothic novel, but it's moving in the direction of romanticism. It's sort of it's no longer Gothic. It's coming out of Gothic and setting up what will come next. And so I think that's a really good, it's a good introduction to Scott's novels if you haven't ever read any of those. And then it's also a really great place to see, okay, so how does this then feed into the next big literary movement, which is Romanticism?
Excellent. I love that. Mine is The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, which I think one of the things I really enjoyed about reading Walpole is that you can see kind of in germ many of the themes and images that are used in later Gothic work. And so I think if you pick up something like The Fall of the House of Usher in conjunction with this, you're able to kind of read them side by side and see, oh, this is kind of how it develops. It's like watching, a film series like that, a kind of fun, like the Alien movies. I've talked about them before. I kind of like those. And so it's kind of fun to watch like the newer ones and then watch the one in the 70s and see like where the conversation, goes based on the similarities, the differences. So I think that's kind of a fun project. The other one, I was thinking about this as we were talking and we were describing the tone and all that. Did you see the movie The Witch?
No. Who was in that?
Oh, what's her name?
Couldn't tell you.
Anya Taylor-Joy, maybe?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah. I don't know if we would count it as Gothic, but I feel like in terms of tone and pacing and all that, it is sort of a Gothic film, or definitely borrows from that. And what I like about it, because I think it is a horror movie, but it's not, there are no jump scares in it. It's kind of beyond that. It's unsettling. There's a sense of foreboding, and there's sort of a big reveal at the end where you go, oh, you could kind of feel it coming and growing as the story progresses. And so for all that, I think that if you can handle it, The Witch is a pretty good film that may kind of be a modern Gothic tale.
Yeah, and the Gothic does generate the genre of horror that is one direction. It's a daughter genre of the Gothic, and I love you pointing us to Edgar Allan Poe because he is a sort of Gothic revival in his stuff. And then, of course, all the Tim Burton stuff. I mentioned him earlier. Tim Burton's artistic vision is very Gothic, and you can see it. And the Gothic is not necessarily macabre, but it can be. That is one direction that it goes, and you definitely can see that influence in these later things. So I think those are all really good trajectories and give a good sense of how influential this little genre has been.
Yep, absolutely. Well, great. Well, thanks for coming on this journey with us as we dive into Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto. Our next read is going to be Love in the Ruins by Walker Percy, which I'm really excited. Have you read that one?
I have not. I'm actually taking it with me on my trip this week so I can read it on the plane.
Excellent. Very good. So we will be back next month. And in the meantime, listeners, keep on reading.